Hey Chevra, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Tzadi Vav of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 96. Chevra, it's a great Daf today. Super cool stuff. So we're gonna continue on the machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Gamliel about can you put on one pair of tefillin or two pair of tefillin when saving tefillin from outside of a city into a city on Shabbos. And we're going to discuss four possibilities about their machlokas. And then that leads into the sugya of the time for putting on tefillin. Can you put on tefillin whenever you want? Maybe only during the day, maybe only during the week. We're going to see different possibilities there. Optional mitzvahs. When a mitzvah is only rishus, is only optional, can you do it? Or maybe is it a violation of Baal Tosef? And then interesting sugya that kind of comes up at the end about thinking about, I don't know, the way I kind of think about it is like considering outlandish possibilities when determining mitzvahs, I guess. We're going to see it comes up in the context of like, can you assume that if you find wool that you can use it for tzitzis, right? It also ties into our sugya of tefillin. If you find, right, we talked about yesterday that the possibility that new tefillin might be actually an amulet. So, to what extent are people gonna, amulets don't normally look like tefillin, right? So to what extent do we have to assume that like maybe this random thing is something else? We'll get there at the end. Okay, we're going to start on Daf Tzadi Hey Amud Beis. We have a little bit of work to do towards the bottom, but I think that this was really the best place to get started for today. So, about 10 lines from the bottom of the page. Lema b'drav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak komifliye. So let's say that the distinction between Rav Meir and Rav Gamliel is about Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Okay. This goes back to what we were talking about yesterday. Let's do a refresher. So Rav Meir says that if you find tefillin outside of the city on Shabbos, so you could put on one pair at a time and bring them into the city. Rav Gamliel says you could put on two pair at a time. And Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says that there's enough physical room on your body to put on two pairs of tefillin. Two shel roshes on your head and two shel yads on your arm. So now, with all that information, so Lema b'Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak komifliye. So let's say that maybe not everybody agrees to this statement of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak that there's enough physical space on your body for two pairs of tefillin. Maybe the Tanakama leisleid Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Rav Gamliel isleid Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Maybe Rav Meir, the Tanakama, does not hold of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. Maybe he says that lemaise there's only enough room on your body for one pair of tefillin. And that's why Reb Meir says, i.e. the Tanakama says, that you'd only be able to put on one pair of tefillin, whereas Rabbi Gamliel holds of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, and therefore assumes that there's enough room on your body for two pairs of tefillin, to accommodate two pairs of tefillin, and therefore you could put on two pairs of tefillin. Lo. Forget about it. No, everybody agrees that there's enough room on your body to put on two pairs of tefillin. Okay. Okay. So, what the Gemara wants to suggest is that the machlokas between the Tanakame and Rabbi Gamliel is whether or not Shabbos is the time to put on tefillin. Right? Is there a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos? The Tanakama savar Shabbos man tefillin, Rabbi Gamliel savar Shabbos lav zman tefillin. That the Tanakama holds that Shabbos is the Zman tefillin, right? That there is a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos, and therefore, once you put on the first pair of tefillin, you're yotze the baseline mitzvah. You're yotze the mitzvah of putting on tefillin once you put on one pair of tefillin, and therefore, once you put on one pair of tefillin, you're yotze the mitzvah, and any additional tefillin that you might put on is extraneous, and it's a possibility that it's a violation of Baal Tosef, of the prohibition against adding on to mitzvahs in the Torah, and therefore, if once you already put on one pair of tefillin, you're yotze the mitzvah. Certainly, if by putting on a second pair of tefillin you're over on Baal Tosef, well then certainly you shouldn't be doing it, and this wouldn't be a way that you would be able to transport tefillin into the city on Shabbos and carry them in their shusarabim, etc. If it's a violation of Baal Tosef. So the Tanakama holds that Shabbos is a time for putting on tefillin, and once you put on one pair of tefillin, you're already yotzei the mitzvah, and therefore you should stop and don't put on a second pair. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel savar Shabbos lav zman tefillinu. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel says no, Shabbos is not the time to put on tefillin, and therefore the reason why you're able to bring in these tefillin has nothing to do with being mekayim any mitzvah of tefillin. It has to do with the fact that tefillin is considered to be a tachshit, right? If you remember back from what was the 5th and 6th bracha of Masechta Shabbos, right, when we talk right, b'meh isha yotza, b'meh behema yotza. So the big nafkamina is this clothing a tachshit or is it a masui? Right? If it's a burden, well then you will be unable to carry it on Shabbos. But if it's a tachshit, if it's an adornment, then you can wear it on Shabbos. And therefore, Gamliel would say, look, there's no mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. However, the Chacham want you to be able to save these tefillin. So they say, look, these tefillin are considered a tachshit, they're considered an adornment, so you can wear them. And therefore, as long as you could, as long as they belong on your body, right? I guess you wouldn't be able to take tefillin and wrap them around your waist as a belt, right? Meaning it would have to be in the proper place. And therefore, there's enough room on your body, as Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said, to put on 2 pairs of tefillin. So therefore, put on 2 pairs of tefillin and bring them in. Nothing to do with the mitzvah. It has to do with saving these tefillin and putting them on and wearing them and bringing them in. And as long as you can fit 2 pairs of tefillin, you can bring them in to the city on Shabbos. Or if you want, I'll give another explanation for the machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel. Now, interestingly, the text of our Gemara says one thing. Rashi mamish flips it around. So I'm going to read it that way because I learned it with Rashi who flips it around. So, or a different way I'll explain it, is Shabbos, Shabbos man tefillin, who everyone agrees that Shabbos is a time for putting on tefillin, that there is a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. Now, here, the machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel is, do you need intention in order to be mekayim a mitzvah? Tanna Kama savar lo bai kavana, Rabbi Gamliel savar bai kavana. So the Tanna Kama says, in order to be mekayim a mitzvah, you don't have to have any kavana, you don't have to have any intention, and therefore, so again, everyone agrees, both Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel agree that there is a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. Now, according to the Tanna Kama, you don't have to have any kavana in order to be mekayim the mitzvah, and therefore, once you put on the first pair of tefillin, you're yotzei the mitzvah. And once you're yotzei the mitzvah with the first pair, you have no business putting on the second pair. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel says that you would need intention in order to be mekayim the mitzvah, and therefore, when you put on both pairs of tefillin without having any intention to be mekayim the mitzvah, well then you're not mekayim the mitzvah, and since it's a tachshit, it's an adornment, you can wear both pairs of tefillin into the city. Okay, very good. A third possibility. Okay, that we could say both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel hold that there is a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos, and both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel hold that mitzvahs do not need kavana, and when you put on that first pair of tefillin, you yotzei the mitzvah. Okay, so then how does Rabbi Gamliel say you could put on a second pair? You could say that the machlokas between Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel is that, do you need kavana in order to violate the prohibition of adding on to the mitzvahs in the Torah, the prohibition of Bal Tosef? The Tanna Kama savar laver mishum Bal Tosef lo bai kavana, and the Tanna Kama holds that you don't need kavana in order to be over on Bal Tosef. Rabbi Gamliel savar laver mishum Bal Tosef bai kavana. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel says to be over on Bal Tosef, you need kavana, meaning, so, both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel hold that there is a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. They also both hold that once you put on that first pair of tefillin, whether you had kavana or not, you're yotzei the mitzvah. The question is when you put on that second pair of tefillin. So the Tanna Kama says, look, even if you don't have kavana to be mekayim a mitzvah or anything, so then when you put on that second pair of tefillin, no matter what, either way, you're going to be over on Bal Tosef, and therefore you can't put it on, and if you put it on, you can't take it into the city. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel says, in order to be over on Bal Tosef, you would have to have kavana, and therefore, as long as you don't have kavana to be mekayim the mitzvah, or so then it would just be a tachshit and you would be able to bring it into the city. Okay? V'baisema, or a fourth possibility. Now, for this possibility, we have to say that both the Tana Kama and Rabbi Gamliel hold that Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin, that there's no mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. Okay, so now says the Gemara in kind of a funny way, Id Svirlan de Shabbos man tefillin, if what we were saying for the last few minutes is correct, that Shabbos is in fact the time to put on tefillin, well, in that case, well, in that case, everyone would agree that even without kavana, you'd be yotze the mitzvah, and even without kavana, you'd be over on Baal Tosef. Everyone would agree to that. But over here, they both agree that Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin. Yet nonetheless, the question is, can you be over on Baal Tosef without kavana? Let's go weiter. Tanakama savar lo bai kavana, Rabbi Gamliel savar lavar shlo bezmanu bai kavana. So the Tanakama says you don't need kavana, whereas Rabbi Gamliel says to be over on Baal Tosef shlo bezmanu you need kavana. Meaning, so we're saying that both Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Meir agree that Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin. However, Rabbi Meir would say that even though Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin, if you do put on tefillin, you will be yotzei mitzvah, whether you have kavanah or not. And when you put on the second pair of tefillin, whether you have kavanah or not, you're going to be over on Baal Tosef. So even though there's no, Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin, there's no reason to be putting on tefillin on Shabbos. If you do put on tefillin on Shabbos, Rabbi Meir would say, the Tanakama would say, that you would still be mekayim a mitzvah, and if you put on the second pair of tefillin, you would still be over in Baal Tosef, whether you have kavanah or not. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel disagrees, and he says, look, Shabbos is not the time to put on tefillin, and if you put them on without kavanah, you're not going to be yotzei any mitzvah, and you're certainly not going to be over on Baal Tosef. Okay, so therefore, Rabbi Gamliel says you're allowed to put on both pairs of tefillin. You don't have any kavanah to be yotzei any mitzvah. There's no mitzvah right now. You can put on both pairs of tefillin, and it's a tachshit, and you can bring it into the city. Whereas Rabbi Meir says, look, even though it's not the time to put on tefillin, if you do put on the tefillin, regardless of your kavanah, you're going to be yotzei a mitzvah with the first pair, and you're going to be over on Baal Tosef on the second pair. Now the Gemara asks, Reb Meir zug echad namilo. But if Reb Meir is saying that regardless of your kavanah, you're going to be yotzei a mitzvah and you're going to be over on Baal Tosef with the second pair, well then even when you put on the first pair, it should be a problem. Because if you say that Shabbos is not the time to be putting on tefillin, so that means that the time to be putting on tefillin is the 6 days of the week. Shabbos you don't put on tefillin. And if, according to Reb Meir, if you do put on tefillin, even if you don't have kavanah, then you're still going to be yotzei a mitzvah. Well, then you're basically adding on to the you're going to be adding on to the mitzvah of tefillin, right? Meaning, if the mitzvah of tefillin is the 6 days of the week, and according to Reb Meir, that when you put on tefillin on the 7th day of the week on Shabbos, even though it's not the proper time to be doing it, but you do it anyways, well, then you're going to be adding on to the mitzvah of tefillin, which is a 6-day-a-week mitzvah, and you're adding a 7th day to it. So that in and of itself should be a problem, and you shouldn't even be able to bring in the first pair into the city. V'od, and more. So ayashim b'shmini b'sukkah yilaka. If somebody sleeps in his sukkah on the 8th day of Sukkot, he gets malchus, meaning the mitzvah of sukkah is 7 days. If a person adds another day to Sukkot, well then, and sleeps in his sukkah on another day, he gets malchus. So how could Reb Meir be suggesting that this fellow can put on the tefillin and bring it into the city if he's saying that it would be considered a mitzvah even with the first pair? Well, then he's adding on to tefillin, which is a 6-day-a-week mitzvah. So, rather, it makes sense, like we said initially, that the machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Meir is about whether or not you say that Shabbos is Zman tefillin or not. That according to Reb Meir, yes, Shabbos is Zman tefillin, and therefore, when you put on the first pair, you're yotze already, don't put on a second pair. And according to Rabbi Gamliel, Shabbos is not Zman Tefillin, and the only reason why you could bring in the Tefillin is because the Chacham wants you to save them, and therefore as long as they fit on your arm and on your head, i.e. 2 pairs, you could bring them into the city. Okay, now the Gemara spends some time trying to figure out who is the Tana that would hold that Shabbos is the time for Tefillin. Uman Shabbos le Shabbos man Tefillin. So who is this Tana that would hold that Shabbos is the proper time to be putting on Tefillin? Now we had just said that it's Reb Meir. Okay, but the Gemara is looking for an explicit approach. So Uman Shabbos le Shabbos man Tefillin, Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so the Gemara wants to say that it's Rabbi Akiva who holds that Shabbos, that you wear tefillin on Shabbos. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, oh, so in the context of tefillin, in the pasuk of, what was it, in the parak of Kadesh, at the end of Parshas Bo, so it says that you will guard this statute at its proper time for all days. Now, this is written in the context of Korban Pesach. However, in that same Parsha, they also talk about tying this remembrance on your arm and on your head, right? So tefillin. So this is one of like the 4 Parshas that are written in the tefillin. So we basically have 2 topics that we're discussing in this Parsha. One is Korban Pesach, and one is tefillin. So we're going to say this is Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili understands this pasuk to be referring to tefillin. Okay, so it says v'shamayta sechuka azos l'moada. So you will guard the statute. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying that this is talking about tefillin. So you will guard tefillin l'moada at its time b'yamim yamima every day. So yamim v'lo leilos. So when it says yamim, it means that you wear tefillin during the day, but not at night. V'lo mi yamim v'lo kol yamim, right? So it doesn't just say, right, yamim yamima. It says mi yamim yamima. So what do we learn from the mem, from the from? So that's also excluding. So mi yamim v'lo kol yamim. It's not going to be every day. Prat l'shabbosos v'yom tov d'vrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, right? To the exclusion of Shabbos and Yom Tov, that is Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. So according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, this pasuk of v'shamayta sechuka hazos l'moada miyamim yamima is talking about tefillin, and it's saying miyamim, that days and not night. Well, yamim is days and not night. Miyamim excludes Shabbos and Yom Tov. So that's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. Rabbi Kiva Omer lo nemar chukazo ela l'inyan Pesach bilvad. So Rabbi Kiva says, no, this pasuk is not talking about tefillin. This pasuk is talking about Korban Pesach. It's saying you'll do the Korban Pesach every year, but don't start excluding or limiting the time of tefillin based on this pasuk. So we see that Rabbi Akiva doesn't have any type of limitation to the time of tefillin, and therefore we want to argue that it's Rabbi Akiva who says that there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos. Ve'ela, the Gemara asks, Hoditnan, that which we learn in a Mishnah, in Kresus, HaPesach v'Hamila mitzvahs esei, that Korban Pesach and Bris Milah are mitzvahs aseh, right? So meaning, in general, something that as we know from Masechta Shabbos, that someone that you'd be chayiv kares for, such as Chilul Shabbos, if you do it by accident, you're chayiv a Korban Chatas. However, Korban Pesach and Bris Milah, which are mitzvahs, that if you do not do them, you're chayiv kares, yet nonetheless, you're not chayiv a Korban Chatas b'shogeg if you do it by accident. So I guess if you accidentally miss the Korban Pesach, you wouldn't bring a Korban Chatas. So lema de lo Rabbi Akiva. So let's say that it's not like Rabbi Akiva, because we're saying that by Korban Pesach and by Bris Milah, the reason why you don't bring a Korban Chatas is because these are mitzvahs aseh. I mean, Shabbos says right, lo sasa kol melacha, don't do any melacha. I.e., there's a mitzvah lo sasa when it comes to Masechta, when it comes to Shabbos, and therefore, if you violate it by accident, violate a mitzvah a lo sasa by accident, so you would bring a Korban Chatas. However, a mitzvah aseh, you would not bring a Korban Chatas if you violate it by accident. Now, let's say that this Mishnah that says that Korban Pesach is a mitzvah aseh, and therefore you don't bring a Korban chatas if you forget to bring it, let's say that is not like Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva, because if it was Rabbi Akiva, well, kevan demuki la b'Pesach lav nami ika. Because since Rabbi Akiva says that this pasuk of V'shamarta sachuka hazos l'moradim yomim yomima is talking about Korban Pesach, well then that means that by Korban Pesach there actually is a lav associated with it. It is a mitzvah lo sa'aseh. Kid Rabbi Oven, Rabbi Eli, like we see from Rabbi Oven in the name of Rabbi Eli, the Rabbi Oven, Rabbi Eli, kol makom shneimar yishamer pen ve'al enu ela below saise. That whenever the pasuk says hishamer, guard or pen or lest ve'al and don't enu ela below saise, it means that this is a treat what the pasuk is talking about as a mitzvah lo saaseh, and therefore by Korban Pesach, according to Rabbi Akiva, v'shamarta sachuka hazos l'moadim yomim yomima. Rabbi Akiva says it's talking about Korban Pesach, and v'shamarta, right, as we see from Rabbi Oven, Rabbi Eli, that the v'shamarta is a lashon of a lo ta'aseh. And since it says in the context of a Korban Pesach, according to Rabbi Akiva, v'shamarta, so that means that there is a lo ta'aseh associated with Korban Pesach, which means that you should be able to bring a Korban Chatas if you forget to bring Korban Pesach. So afilu teimu Rabbi Akiva, says the Gemara, you can even say that Rabbi Akiva is the author of this Mishnah, or at least that this Mishnah is in line with Rabbi Akiva. Hishamer de lav, hishamer de aseh. Depends. If it says hishamer in the context of a lav, right? Rashi gives examples. For example, hishamer lecha pentichros bris vigomer, right? That guard yourself, pen, lest you make a covenant with the people who live in Eretz Yisrael, right? In that case, hishamer means that it's a lo ta'aseh. But hishamer da aseh, but if it says hishamer in the context of an aseh, such as Korban Pesach, well, that would not be a lav. And therefore, even according to Rabbi Akiva, we wouldn't necessarily say that Korban Pesach has a lo ta'aseh component to it. And therefore, if you forget to bring Korban Pesach, you wouldn't bring a Korban Chatas. Now, the Gemara asks, V'sav Rabbi Akiva Shabbos man tefillinu? Wait a second. Does Rabbi Akiva really hold that Shabbos is the time to put on tefillin? That there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos? V'atanya, but we learn in the Brisa, Rabbi Akiva Omer, says Rabbi Akiva, Yachol yaniach adam tefillin b'Shabbosos v'Yom Tov? Is it possible that a person would put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov? That it says by tefillin that the tefillin will be a sign on your arm. Mishatzrichin os. So you only put on tefillin on a day that needs a sign. Epis, a regular day of the week. Not Shabbos or Yom Tov, nothing special. So we need a sign that we could point to and say, look, you see, we're following Torah, we're following mitzvahs, that even on a day like today where there's nothing else going on, we are doing an activity that shows that we are connected to God. Yatsu Elu, to the exclusion of Shabbos and Yom Tov, Shein Gufanos, that they themselves are a sign, right? Why are we sitting around and we're not doing any malacha or anything like that? Because we follow God's Torahs and His commandments and His Torah. So on a day like Shabbos and Yom Tov, we don't need tefillin to indicate that we follow God and His Torah. However, on a regular day, we use tefillin as that sign. Ella, Haitan, right? So we see that according to Rabbi Akiva, you do not put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So interestingly, Rabbi Akiva says that pasuk of Shamarta Sachuka Hazos L'Moadim Yomim Yomima is talking about Korban Pesach. Okay, so he doesn't learn out any thing about tefillin from that. However, from the pasuk of so tefillin are a sign, to the exclusion of Shabbos and Yom Tov, that we don't need a sign because they themselves are a sign. However, Rabbi Akiva would say that you could put on tefillin at night, that there's a mitzvah at night, because to exclude night, that was learned out from that pasuk by Korban Pesach, Miyamim Yamima. Rabbi Akiva says that's talking about Korban Pesach, it's not talking about tefillin. So Rabbi Akiva has no reason to limit putting on tefillin to the daytime. However, he does limit tefillin to weekdays because of the sign aspect of it. Elahai Tanu. So rather, the Tana who says that Shabbos is the proper time for tefillin is the following Tana. Titania, as we learn in the Brisa, Neir Balayla, if a person is awake during the night. Okay, I mean, right now in many places in places where I'm sure many of us are, the nighttime already starts at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, right? So ner balayla, somebody who's awake at night. So ratza choletz, ratza maniach. Look, if you want, you can take off your tefillin. If you want, you can put on your tefillin. It makes no difference. Divrei Reb Nosson, that's Reb Nosson's opinion. Yonasan Akitoni Omer, ein manichin tefillin balayla. Whereas Yonatan Akitoni Omer, you guys know who that is? I don't. Ein manichin tefillin balayla. You don't put on tefillin at night. Midalayla, the Tanakam is man tefillin. Shabbos nam is man tefillin. So since we see that the Tanakam Reb Nosson is saying that you could put on tefillin at night, so if you could put on tefillin at night, so mistama you can also put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But the Gemara says, "V'dilma sfir le'layla zman tefillinu, Shabbos lav zman tefillinu." Maybe Reb Nosson says that the nighttime you could put on tefillin, but not on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Dashaminan le Rabbi Akiva, because we know that Rabbi Akiva's opinion, as we just saw, is the Amar Laila Zman Tefillinu, Shabbos Lav Zman Tefillinu. So we know Rabbi Akiva's opinion is that you could put on tefillin at night because he doesn't exclude it from the pasuk of Miyamim Yamima, which he says is talking about Korban Pesach. So Rabbi Akiva says you could put on tefillin at night. There's no reason why not. Yet you would not put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov because they themselves are a sign. So maybe Reb Nosson holds like Rabbi Akiva in the same way that you put on tefillin at night but not on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Okay. So we're still searching for that Tana who says that Shabbos and Yom Tov is the time for tefillin. So Elahai Tanahu. So rather, it is the following Tana. The Tana is within a brayso Michal Bas Kushi. Michal Bas Kushi, who is that? Michal Bas Shaul. Michal, the daughter of Shaul, the wife of David HaMelech. So she would put on tefillin, and it seems to be, and the Chacham were okay with it. They didn't say anything to her. V'ishto shel Yonah, and the wife of Yonah ben Amitai, Yonah the prophet who we read about on Yom Kippur, she would be Ola Regel. She would go up to Jerusalem on the holidays and be Mekayim the mitzvah of going up to Jerusalem on the holidays, and the Chachamim were cool with that also. Now from the fact that the Chacham didn't say anything to Michal Bas Shaul when she put on tefillin, it must be that it's a mitzvah saseh shelo azman grama, right? We learned already Masechta Brachos that it also came up here in Masechta Ayruvin, the beginning of I think the third parak, that mitzvah saseh shazman grama, women are peturos, right? A mitzvah saseh that has a specific time, so women do not have a chiyuv to do it, and therefore the assumption at this point is that, and if women, and therefore if you do a mitzvah that you don't have an obligation to do, it would be Bal Tosef. It would be the issue of Bal Tosef, of adding onto the Torah, as we saw, as we were discussing earlier. And therefore, from the fact that Michal Bat Shaul put on tefillin, and the Chacham didn't say anything, it must mean that it's not Bal Tosef, i.e. that it's a mitzvah for her to put on tefillin. And if it's a mitzvah for her to put on tefillin, then it must mean that it wouldn't then be a mitzvah saseh shezman grama, because if it was a mitzvah saseh shezman grama, she would be ptura, and therefore putting them on would be Bal Tosef. So therefore it must be that these rabbis assumed that that Shabbos, that tefillin you can always put on, including Shabbos, including nighttime, all the time, and that's why when Michal Bat Shaul put on tefillin, the Chacham didn't say anything. So it must be that these rabbis are the ones who hold that it's also a mitzvah to put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and at night it's always a time to put on tefillin. There's no time limitation. But one second, that might not be a good proof. The opinion of Rabbi Yossi is that when it comes to smicha is leaning on an animal before shechting it, right? So if you come to bring a korban, I think let's say maybe like a korban chatas, so before slaughtering it, the person who offers the korban would lean on it. And it says in the pasuk Bnei Yisrael, V'lo Bnos Yisrael, that the boys do smicha, not the girls. However, Rabbi Yossi's opinion is that, look, the commandment, the obligation is for the Bnei Yisrael, but if a woman wants to do smicha on her korban, she's allowed to. She's allowed to do it optionally, even though there's no obligation. And therefore, perhaps these rabbis held like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore their opinion is that you would not put on tefillin at night, and you would not put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. However, so it's a mitzvah saseh shezman grama, therefore nashim are peturos, women are peturos, and Michal maybe didn't have an obligation to put on tefillin, but she'd be allowed to put on tefillin if she wants to, and maybe that's why the Chacham didn't say anything. And therefore, that's not a proof that these rabbis hold that tefillin is an obligation all the time. It's possible that they also agree that you wouldn't put it on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but they hold like Rabbi Yossi that just because you don't have an obligation to do something, that doesn't mean that you're unable to do something. So the ilote machi. Now you have to say this if you think about it, that these rabbis assume that tefillin is a mitzvah saseh shezman grama, because ishto shel Yona haisa'ola l'regel v'lo michu b'chachamim. Right? We also said over there that Yona's wife would go and be ola regel, and they wouldn't say anything. Now mi'ikalam the amar regel of mitzvah saseh shezman grama. So obviously there's nobody who would say that being ola l'regel is not a mitzvah saseh shezman grama, meaning obviously shalosh regalim or shalosh pamim bashana, 3 times a year, and there are specific times. So obviously going up to be ola regel is a mitzvah saseh shezman grama. Yet nonetheless the chachamim were cool with Yona's wife being ola regel. So elakasav rishus. Rather, it must be because they were holding that it's optional for Yona's wife to be ola regel, and if she wants to, she can. So achanami rishus. So here also we'll say that by Michal Bas Shaul they didn't say anything because she's allowed to put on tefillin, even if she's not obligated, she's allowed to, and therefore even if it is a mitzvah aseh shezman grama, she would still be allowed to, and it's not a proof. We still don't know who would say that putting on tefillin would be even on Shabbos. So Ella, hi Tana, rather it is the following Tana. Okay, the Tana, as we learn in the Brisa, Hamotze tefillin machnisan zug zug. Okay, so if somebody finds tefillin on Shabbos, so he brings them into the city, one pair at a time. Echad ha'ish ve'echad ha'isha. Whether the person who finds the tefillin is a man, whether the person who finds the tefillin is a woman. Echad chadashos ve'echad yishanos divrei Meir. Whether these tefillin are new, whether they are old, i.e., whether we know with 100% certainty that they in fact are tefillin, or whether they might be some kind of amulet. Divrei Meir, that is Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda oser b'chadashos umater b'yishanos. Rabbi Yehuda says new tefillin you'd have to leave there because they might be an amulet, but old tefillin that you know for sure are tefillin, you could bring them into the city. Adkan lo pligi ela b'chadashos v'yishanos. Now the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is about whether or not you can bring in new tefillin into the city or not. Aval b'isha lo pligi. But there's no argument when it comes to the woman, meaning both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda agree that if a woman finds tefillin outside of the city, she could bring them into the city. So that must mean that they hold that tefillin is a mitzvah aseh shelo azman gramahu, that there's no time limitation to it. And any mitzvah that is not time bound, that is always readily doable, so then women are chayavos. So the implication seems to be that from the fact that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir agree that if a woman finds tefillin outside of a city on Shabbos, she would bring it into the city on Shabbos, that must mean that she is chayavis in the mitzvah of tefillin. I guess the assumption being that if she wasn't chayavis in the mitzvah of tefillin, that there was no mitzvah to do, well then, I guess, either way you cut it, she wouldn't be Mekayim the mitzvah, meaning according to, we said that if Shabbos is man tefillin, so then she would be Mekayim the mitzvah, and as being Mekayim the mitzvah, she would put them on and take them into the city. And we say if it's not, right, if there's no mitzvah to put on tefillin, so then we said, well then it will be an adornment, she can bring it into the city, but I guess if she's not shaykh to the mitzvah b'chlal, then maybe it wouldn't be considered an adornment, it would just be considered a masuri, I guess. So from the fact that she's able to bring it into the city, must mean that she's shaykh to the mitzvah of tefillin, and therefore, if she's shaykh to the mitzvah of tefillin, we want to say that must be because it's mitzvah saseh shelo azman grama, that there's no time limitation, and therefore there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin even on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But now the Gemara asks, but maybe Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are on the same page as Rabbi Yossi. That women can do smicha on a korban if they want to, right? Optionally. and therefore maybe Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir also agree that you do not put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and it is a mitzvah saseh she'ezman grama, but even though it's a mitzvah saseh she'ezman grama, women can do it optionally, and for that reason, they could bring in these tefillin on Shabbos into the city. So, lo salkadatech. No, do not say that. V'lo Reb Meir savalak Reb Yossi, v'lo Reb Yehuda savalak Reb Yossi, because neither Reb Meir nor Reb Yehuda hold like Reb Yossi about doing mitzvahs optionally. Lo Reb Meir savalak Reb Yossi. Reb Meir does not hold like Reb Yossi. The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, in ma'akvin satinokos miliskoa hanoshim me'akvin, that on Rosh Hashanah we do not we do not hold back children from blowing shofar, meaning not to be motzi other people, but if they want to blow shofar, they can, as Rashi points out, mishum chinuch, because of learning how to do it. So because we don't mind if they want to learn how to do it, so they can blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. But a woman wouldn't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, because since she's not going to be motzi other people, so then it says niros kimosifos. It's like they're adding on to a mitzvah. So therefore they wouldn't blow the shofar, according to Reb Meir. V'stam masnis Reb Meir. Now, Stam Mishnah is Rebbe Meir. So this Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah that we just quoted would be the opinion of Rebbe Meir. And Rebbe Meir is saying that women would not blow shofar, even optionally, because it would be like Baal Tosef. So clearly Reb Meir does not hold like Reb Yossi, who says that even if you don't have an obligation to do a mitzvah, you still can do it optionally. Okay. Reb Yehuda also does not hold like Reb Yossi. The Tanyas, we learn in the Brisa, Dabro b'nei Yisrael v'samach, that in the context of smicha that we saw earlier, so it says, speak to b'nei Yisrael v'samach, b'nei Yisrael somchen v'im b'nos Yisrael somchos, that the b'nei Yisrael, the men do smicha, the women don't do smicha. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon omim nashim somchos v'shus, whereas Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon disagree and say that women would be are able to do smicha on a korban optionally if they would like to. V'stam sifra mani Rabbi Yehuda. And just like we know that a stam mishnah is Rabbi Meir, well, a stam sifra, a stam medrash halacha from Sefer Vayikra, such as this one about smicha, is by default Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, we can assume that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's saying that women may not do smicha on a korban optionally, whereas Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon disagree and say that you can do it optionally. And therefore, we see that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who say that women who find tefillin outside of a city would be able to bring it into the city on Shabbos, well, they also hold that women would be unable to put on tefillin optionally, so it must mean that they have an obligation to put on tefillin, because it is a mitzvah saseh shelo azman grama, which means that the mitzvah of tefillin is on Shabbos and in Yom Tov and at night, always. Okay, Chevre. Amr Belazar says, Belazar amotzi tcheles b'shuk. Okay, so what if somebody finds wool in the market, right? You find wool and it's tcheles, it's the tzitzis color. Can you use them for your tzitzis? So the shon is psulis chutin ksherin. Well, so if you find just like a clump of dyed, combed wool, well then you cannot use it, because because the wool would have to be made lishma. It would have to be made with intention of using them for tzitzis. And this clump of wool that is already combed and dyed, we don't know if it was combed and dyed for the intention of tzitzis. Therefore, you'd be unable to use them for tzitzis. Chutin ksherin. But if you find threads of tcheles, then you would be able to use them for your tzitzis. You can assume that they're lishma for tzitzis. Ma'ishna lishonis psule. Ma'ishna lishonis. How come we say that if you find a clump of wool, you'd be unable to use it for tzitzis? Well, because we say, who knows that they were made for tzitzis? Maybe they were made for just a regular old garment. So but why don't we say the same thing by the threads? That the threads were spun specifically for clothing and not for tzitzis. So how come we could use the threads for tzitzis? Bishizurim. My answer is because we're talking about threads that were twisted. Since they're twisted already, they can be used we can assume that they're for tzitzis. Shizurim nami, nema adaita the sifs of the glima ifinu. But even the twisted threads, maybe they were twisted to use for the hem of a garment. So b'mufsakin. So it's talking about where these threads were not only twisted, but they were also cut into sizes that are perfect for tzitzis strings. So at that point you can assume that they are for tzitzis. Because nobody would go out of their way in order to now like retie these strings onto like a loom or something and weave them into a hem. Like that's a little bit overkill. We don't have to use our imaginations to that extent to think that somebody might actually be intending to weave these into a garment. Therefore you can assume that they are for tzitzis. Amar Rava, says Rava, says Rava, but I don't know about that. People could do pretty outlandish things, right? Does a person go out of his way to make an amulet look like tefillin? T'tnan, as we learn in our Mishnah, when do we say that you could bring tefillin from outside the city into the city on Shabbos? B'yishanis, if the tefillin are old, i.e. if it's clear that these tefillin are in fact tefillin. Hava b'chadash is potter. But if the tefillin were new, i.e. there's reason for us to suspect that, as crazy as it sounds, maybe this is some kind of an amulet. And therefore, says Rava, people do pretty wild things. And yeah, we should be concerned that maybe these strings that look like it's pretty clear that they're tzitzis strings, maybe they are not tzitzis strings. Amr Reb Zera, the Ahava Brei. So Reb Zera said to his son Ahava, very interesting name. Reb Zera's son's name was Love. Pok Tnilahu, says Reb Zera to his son, go and teach the following brisa. Hamotze tcheles b'shuk, somebody who finds tcheles in the market, the shonas psulin chutim mufsakin ksherin. Well, if they are, clumps of wool, well then you would be unable to use them for tzitzis. But if they were threads that are already cut to size, ksherin, you would be able to use them for tzitzis. Because a person is not going to go out of his way to, and he's not going to now retie them so that he can put them in a loom. No, you can assume that at that point they are for tzitzis. So we see that Reb Zera is bringing a brisa to settle this, right? There's a brisa that says that once you have strings that are already cut to size, you can assume that they're for tzitzis because nobody's going to go out of their way to that extent to still use those for anything other than for tzitzis. So Amarav Mishum Detanila Hava Brei to Reb Zera Kifei Talala, and Rava's not satisfied. He says, what? Just because Reb Zera had his son Ahava teach a brisa that says that a person wouldn't go out of his way, that means that's the halacha. It's settled. Kifei Talala, right? That we're gonna, hang necklaces, beautiful necklaces on it, and declare it the winner. But we learn in a Mishnah. We learn in our Mishnah, right? We still have our Mishnah that says that if you have new tefillin, you wouldn't be able to bring them into the city because you have to be concerned that maybe it's an amulet, as crazy as that sounds. So people, so even though, sure, Reb Zera brought a brisa that says that people would not be toreach to go out of their way to do outlandish things, but we have our Mishnah that says that you have to assume that maybe the tefillin is an amulet, i.e. people do out of their way to do like weird things. So Ela Amarava, rather Rava says, Torach v'lo Torach Tanaihi. Says, look, it's machlokas Tanaim. The Tanya, as we learn in a brisa, Motze tefillin, machnisan zug zug, right? As we saw in a brisa a little bit earlier on this Amud, that if somebody finds tefillin outside of the city, so he brings them into the city one pair at a time, echad ish ve'echad isha, both men and women, echad chadashus ve'echad yishanis divrei Reb Meir. Whether these are new tefillin, whether these are old tefillin, that's Reb Meir's opinion, because he says even new tefillin you can bring into the city. People are not toreach to go out of their way to make amulets that look like tefillin. Rabbi Yehuda oser b'chadashus umater b'yishanis. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, you can bring in old tefillin into the city, but not new tefillin. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that, yeah, people can go out of their way and do weird things and make amulets that look like tefillin, and therefore you have to be concerned that maybe these tefillin are actually amulets and you cannot bring them into the city. Whereas Reb Meir says, no, you can bring them into the city. People are not going to go out of their way to make amulets that look like tefillin. You can assume that if they look like tefillin, they are tefillin, and you can bring them into the city. Chevre, that was Daf Tzadi Vav of Masechta Ayruvin. Let's go over some of the, there was a lot on this page, a lot of interesting stuff on this page. So we started talking about, discussing the machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Gamliel about, Reb Meir says you can bring in one pair of tefillin at a time. Reb Gamliel says 2 pairs at a time. We had 4 different ways of understanding that machlokas. The first one was to say it's machlokas about is Shabbos zman tefillin or not. That according to Reb Meir, Shabbos is zman tefillin, therefore you can only put in 1 pair, because once you put on 1, you already yotzei the mitzvah, you have no business putting on a second. Whereas Reb Gamliel says Shabbos is not zman tefillin, and therefore the reason why you're putting them in is because to save them, and therefore you're putting them on as an article of clothing, and as long as you could fit them on in their proper place, i.e. 2 pairs, then you could bring them in. The other way of understanding was that everybody says that Shabbos is zman tefillin. It's just a question of, do you need kavanah or not? According to Reb Meir, you don't need kavanah, and therefore once you put on the first pair, you're already yotzei the mitzvah, don't put on the second one. According to Reb Meir, you do not need kavanah. According to Reb Gamliel, you do need kavanah. Therefore, if you didn't have kavanah to be yotzei the mitzvah, well then you're not yotzei the mitzvah, and it's a tachshit, it's an adornment, and therefore you could bring in 2 pairs. The other way of understanding it, a third way, is that everyone agrees that Shabbos is zman tefillin, and everyone agrees that you do not need kavanah to be yotzei. The question is, do you need kavanah to be over on Baal Tosef? So according to Reb Meir, you don't need kavanah, and even without kavanah, you're over on Baal Tosef, therefore you shouldn't be bringing it into the city, the second pair. Whereas according to Reb Gamliel, you would need kavanah to be over on Baal Tosef, and therefore as long as you don't have kavanah, you're not over on Baal Tosef, and you can bring in even the second pair. The fourth way of understanding it was that no, everyone agrees that Shabbos is not zman tefillin. And the question is that if you put on tefillin, even though it's not zman tefillin, are you still going to be yotzei the mitzvah and over on Baal Tosef? So Reb Meir says, look, even if it's not zman tefillin, still by putting on the tefillin, you're doing a mitzvah, and by putting on the second pair, you're over on Baal Tosef. So therefore, only put on 1 pair. And according to Reb Gamliel, he says, look, if you don't have kavanah, you're not going to be, it's not zman tefillin. You're not doing any mitzvahs. You're not over on Baal Tosef. Therefore, you can put on both pairs. The Gemara ended up throwing out the 4th possibility, and saying that we should really just go with the first possibility, which that it's machlokas about is Shabbos zman tefillin or not, which then segued into the question of, so whose opinion is it, or really, well, whose opinion? The Gemara wanted to know whose opinion is it that Shabbos is zman tefillin. But I think you can really kind of view it also as like, what are the different opinions regarding the times to wear tefillin? So Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion was that tefillin is a daytime thing. You don't wear tefillin at night, and you don't wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, because we have the pasuk that says, "V'shemata sechuka hazos l'moadim yomim yamima." Right, yomim excludes nights, and miyamim excludes Shabbos and Yom Tov. That's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. Rabbi Kiva, his opinion is that you wear it at night because that pasuk is talking about Korban Pesach, but you don't wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov because it says os, a sign by tefillin, and Shabbos and Yom Tov is already a tefillin, a sign, so you don't wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda say that tefillin is a mitzvah to say shelo azman grama, which means that you wear tefillin at night, you wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. We talked about doing optional mitzvahs. Can you do a mitzvah even if you don't have an obligation to do so? So Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say, yes, you could do a mitzvah optionally, whereas Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda say, no, you do not do a mitzvah optionally. And then at the end we talked about considering outlandish possibilities in the context of mitzvahs. So for example, if you find strings of tcheles that are cut to size, can you assume that they're for tzitzis? And also, if you find tefillin, can you assume that they're tefillin, or do you have to be concerned that maybe they're an amulet? So Meir's opinion is that, look, you have to be concerned that maybe the tefillin are, no, it says no, you do not have to be concerned that maybe the tefillin are an amulet. You don't have to be concerned that somebody's going to be toreach to go out of his way to make something crazy like an amulet that looks like tefillin. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you do have to be concerned, and therefore you'd be unable to bring in the amulet. And Mistama also, he would be of the opinion that if you find these tcheles in the shuk, Mistama, you can use it for tzitzis, because the person wouldn't go out of his way to then put them back on the loom and create a hem with these strings that are already spun and that are already twisted and cut to size. That was Daf Tzadi Vav Masechta Ayruvin. Hope you enjoyed. Peace.